Okay, so this is the third free webinar in the COVID-19 Investigating the Truth series. And this is specifically focusing on your human rights and actions you can take to protect them. So we're going to go through some aspects of this presentation that include the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which feature universally accepted human rights and what should be the basis for free societies. Um, we're also going to look at the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, the Criminal Code of Canada, the Emergency Act of Canada, and then we're going to also look at some information from Rocco Galati and John Carpe, who are both constitutional attorneys here in Canada, including the duties and rights of businesses, your rights as an individual for the masks, and also for the lockdown orders. We're going to look at informed consent and other actions that you can take to protect your rights. So let's get started.
Come on, we can't go away. We don't need them, we don't need them, oh, oh. We can be free by ourselves.
I love that song, and there's a reason that I started each of my webinars with that song from Kids Waste, Free. It's very simple, but in the lyrics, it says, we don't need them. We can be free by ourselves. And it's time for us to free ourselves. And that's what this is about. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. This is a quote from Nelson Mandela. We have throughout history had challenges, um, fights to take away our inherent human rights. And they were written down and defined so that we could remember these rights and we could fight for them, we could stand up for them, we could be vigilant. There are always those who seek to control and infringe upon other people's rights. They may not even intentionally do so, but there's a desire to impose a worldview, an individual's worldview on others and wanting everyone else to accept the way that they see things, accept the way that they believe things should be done. Fortunately, we have role models who have defied that concept and who respect the worldviews of all of us and who have challenged the one being superior over the other and proposed instead unity and diversity, cooperation, respect for the individual. Where worlds collide, we can learn to collaborate and coexist peacefully. First and foremost, it's important to remember that you, as an individual human being, a living being existing as you are in this reality right now, you are sovereign. Sovereignty, and this you can find on Wikipedia very easily, is the full right and power of a governing body over itself, without any interference from outside sources or bodies, and that includes a human being. Self ownership, also known as sovereignty of the individual or individual sovereignty, is the concept of property in one's own person, expressed as the moral or natural right of a person to have bodily integrity and be the exclusive controller of one's own body and life. And this is very important, and we'll get into this a bit more. But the opposite of this is slavery. You are a slave to another if you give up your sovereignty. John Locke wrote in his two treatises on government that every man has a property in his own person. He also said that the individual has a right to decide what would become of himself and what he would do, and as having a right to reap the benefits of what he did. The UN Declaration of Human Rights. It was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on the 10th of December 1948, after World War II, as a common standard of achievements for all peoples and all nations. It sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected, and it has been translated into over 500 languages. This is the reason why I'm focusing on what is declared in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in this particular document. And yes, there have been abuses, and yes, the UN has been involved in some abuses of human rights around the world. The point, however, is that if you read through this document and you recognize truth in what is stated here, then you can defend that truth, regardless of those who would wish to abuse it or wish to put this statement up as just window dressing while they commit abuses behind the scenes. We can hold those accountable for not standing up for the rights of others. And we can use documents such as these to remind ourselves of what our values are. In the preamble, it states, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Just take that first part right there. Inherent dignity. This is something that you are born with, all of you, and of the equal and inalienable. That means inseparable. It is you, it is part of you. The rights of all members of the human family. This is the foundation, the bedrock of freedom, justice, and peace. Without these, there is no freedom, justice, or peace. That is the meaning of this statement. And you can take apart each statement that I'm going to go over in this declaration and in other parts of this presentation. And when you get to the essence of what each statement means, you will see the truth that is in there. And it's not bound by fancy words or fancy language, but it's something we all recognize as being true. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have a recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. And member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the UN, the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is recognized as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under this jurisdiction. Now, here I'm going to recognize that in the course of abuses of human rights that have been committed by global organizations, by governments, and they state that it's in the common good of the people, for the fight to preserve democracy, to promote these human rights. If they actually violate the inherent dignity and inalienable rights of any human member of our family, our global family, then they are in violation of these rights. They are not in support of these rights. Article 1 states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Remember this, because later on there's another article that states how they're granted to you by governments. But no, you are born free and equal in dignity and rights. You are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, that second half of that sentence, should act, that is a recommendation, but not a rule. And what's interesting about that is that if you come to know yourself, to truly know who you are, what makes you up, how you function in the global existence, the universal existence of all that you can perceive, that can be your greatest achievement. It is the true path of science, the exploration and experimentation that we call life. When you do that, you can recognize that all of our perceptions, all of our unique experiences are subjective realities, and there is complexity in that that leaves space for the unexpected, that makes us aware that we cannot know every single thing, and therefore leaves us humble and noble at the same time. When you know yourself, you will truly begin to respect the adage, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When you start to know yourself, then you respect the many various parts of you, the many various voices, the past parts of you, the present parts of you. You are a unique amalgamation that is dynamic, which means constantly changing. And if you recognize that, you'll recognize that this is something that holds true for all other humans. And we are all fallible. We are all somewhat biased. We are not better than or less than, but we are different. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. This is a quote written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who won a Nobel Prize for his work. I came across his work a long time ago when I was looking into different aspects of human rights initiatives and historical events, including what happened in Russia and the gulags there. And Solzhenitsyn himself served time in the gulags and wrote literature that was able to escape and make its way into the West. And what he points out, and what others have pointed out who have experienced life in oppressive societies, is that it's not a system because there are no systems without the parts. It's the people. And we have to recognize, do I have it within myself to take away another human being's rights and dignity? Do I feel there is ever a justification to do so? Have I ever questioned this? Because you will be confronted with events that will challenge that. And you need to know where you draw the line. Article 2 states that everyone is entitled to the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs. Your sovereignty, your human sovereignty, is not subject to any government governing body, to any collective group. It can also not be denied to you if you have another opinion, another religion. We recognize that you have certain rights and freedoms as a human being in this shared reality. Article 3 states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And we're going to talk a bit later about the right to life and um, sadly, the medical mismanagement that happened in long term care homes and hospitals. Liberty, we're going to talk about throughout this, but let's look at security of person and what that means. Well, if you look it up on Wikipedia, which again is another simple source that you can investigate into some of the more mm, uh, non controversial topics, but I'm sure you could find better sources. Security of person is a basic entitlement that's guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the UN. It's also a human right explicitly defined and guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights, the Constitution of Canada, the Constitution of South Africa, and other laws around the world. In general, the right to the security of one's person is associated with liberty and includes the right, if one is imprisoned unlawfully, to a remedy such as habeas corpus. Security of person can also be seen as an expansion of rights based on prohibitions of torture and cruel and unusual punishment. And we're going to expand on torture and cruel and unusual punishment because it's important to understand what that means. Rights to security of person can guard against less lethal conduct and can be used in regard to prisoners' rights. In Canada, in particular, the right to security of person was recognized in the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960. Section 1A of this law recognized the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. In 1982, a right to security of the person was added to the Constitution. It was included in Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which stipulates that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and so on. Security of the person in Section 7 consists of rights of privacy of the body and its health, and of the right protecting the psychological integrity of an individual. That is, the right protects against significant government inflicted harm, such as stress, to the mental state of the individual. So let's look at this case mentioned here, Blencoe v. BC, Supreme Court case. Justice Bastarach finds that Section 7 can extend beyond the sphere of criminal law, at least where there is state action which directly engages the justice system and its administration. So first, it must be determined if there has been a violation of life, liberty, or security of person. And second, the violation must be shown to be contrary to the principles of fundamental justice. Liberty is related to personal autonomy. It is engaged where state compulsions or prohibitions affect important and fundamental life choices. Security of person also concerns psychological harm, and it must be established that the state caused actual psychological harm and that there have been serious injuries. Now, I mention this for two reasons. One, there is the personal autonomy, and that includes the rights of privacy of the body and its health. Okay, and then psychological harm or psychological integrity. And this is important because we're seeing our bodily autonomy being taken away. We're being told what to wear on our face. We're being told um, to social distance. We're being told to adopt medical interventions without our informed consent and without being able to choose not to do so. So that violates many things, including our inherent rights of conscience and so on. But the psychological harm is another important factor because if you took my COVID 19 Investigating the Truth series, parts one and two, one looked at the science and two looked at what's really going on, you'll remember that what we're doing is causing psychological harm to people. And there is some intentional intention behind this, including a public health strategy that induces fear amongst the populace so that they comply with the orders, the medical orders that are being brought down. And this was exposed by Dr. Peter Bregan, a psychiatrist in the United States who's given evidence in the Ohio landmark lawsuit challenging the emergency declaration. So, this is something that you should keep note of. Article 4 states that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. It's important to note what exactly slave and slavery means. And of course, here they also mention servitude, not just slavery. Okay, so slave is someone who is owned as the property of someone else, especially in involuntary servitude. It is one who is subservient to or controlled by another, and one who is subject to or controlled by a specified influence. And of course, slavery is the condition in which one person is owned as property by another and is under the owner's control. If you do not have the option to say no and to walk away, if you are not allowed to make your own choice, if you are not allowed to have free will, then you are a slave. Then you are in servitude and you are serving a master. Now, there's that famous song quote that talks about how everybody, I believe it was, oh, what's his name? Bob Dylan. I could be wrong. You could correct me. Where everybody has to serve somebody. The truth is that if you are master of yourself, then it is only you that you serve ultimately. And again, this goes back to knowing yourself. Because if you know yourself, you know that you are many and you are deeply interconnected with all that is. When you serve yourself, when you benefit yourself, truly benefit yourself, not grab for things that fulfill greed or do harm to another, because you see the ultimate consequences of doing that. When you truly benefit yourself, you're benefiting everything around you and everyone around you. And that is being master of yourself. But if you abdicate that personal authority, then you let somebody else become your master and you can easily be manipulated. Someone who is manipulated is a slave. Someone who abdicates their right to choose is a slave. You should question how you make your choices. And even if you agree with doing something, do you have the option to say no? If not, you don't really have a choice. So Article 5 states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Torture is the infliction of severe pain, physical pain, as a means of punishment or coercion. And we're going to look at what coercion is. It can also be mental pain or agony that you're put through, or anguish. Both physical and mental pain can put a person into a state of just wanting it to stop. So they will do anything. And that is why no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And of course, inhuman, if you investigate, ask yourself, what does it mean to be human? Well, the opposite would be lacking kindness, pity, or compassion. You would be cruel or indifferent about another's suffering. It would also be something that's not suited for human needs. And if you looked at my part one, the science and investigating the truth, you'll know that in science, we know that it is essential, it is a human need for social contact, for physical, face to face social contact and gatherings. That the opposite of that promotes less immune function, promotes illness, promotes depression, promotes mental health issues. So, when we consider public health measures, this is why it's so important to look at the bigger picture and also for medical advice, why it should be individualized. And I'm not talking about genetically based medicine. No, I'm talking about the whole person, the whole person's experience, how they function. And you can only get that through actual interaction, through caring, through the desire to understand. The Criminal Code of Canada also talks about torture, and in section 269.1, they state that every official or every person acting at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of an official who inflicts torture on any other person is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years. What we're looking at right now with the way that the media is acting, they are complicit in the torture of the common people, the health ministers as well, and all of the people who are enforcing the lockdown measures. Just think about it and read that statement again on torture. Now, coercion, as defined in the Encyclopedia of Canadian Laws, in the context of political science in Canada, is power based on authorized physical force, including police, armed forces, jails, etc., on which the government has a near monopoly. It's also used by class analysts as a term for what government does at the behest of the corporate elite when the state cannot otherwise get the public to accept its decisions. And the Cambridge Dictionary definition is the use of force to persuade someone to do something that they are unwilling to do. So, again, the public health measure of using fear to force compliance, that is coercion. They are also using fear to promote the agenda of big pharma. Big pharma is corporate elite. And if you aren't aware of big pharma acting as organized crime, I would suggest you look into the work of Dr. Peter Gertza on exposing that and his book Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime. There is good documented evidence for that. Okay, so force, the definition of this is the capacity to do work or cause physical change, energy, strength, or active power, and power made operative against resistance or exertion. So the constant media messaging, this is this is part of the plan. It was to flood the media with messages and repetition and repetition and repetition. This is a force used to coerce people to follow what they want. So coercion can be more than just physical force. It's the implied threat of monetary fines, of imprisonment, of the loss of a job, and so on. The implied threat of the full force of the state, and the threat of social isolation, public shaming, being ostracized. These psychological forces are used to compel obedience, and that goes against your human rights. Now, this is recognized in an article from Foreign Policy on smart power. You have the hard power of coercion and the soft power of attraction. The two go together. And leadership, they state, in the global information age is less about being the king of the mountain, issuing commands that cascade down in hierarchy, than being the person in the center of a circle or network who attracts and persuades others to come and help. And I talk about this in part two, investigating what's really going on with the con man's game. Okay, this is the persuasive use of coercion. You have the fear aspect, and you also employ language that appeals to people's better natures, where they won't investigate it, but they'll go along with your plan. Both the hard power of coercion and the soft power of attraction and persuasion are crucial to success. So they also state how Americans need to better understand both these dimensions of smart power, and probably not what they intended from this article, but what you can take away from that is that yes, you do need to understand these tools of manipulation. Because again, if you are manipulated, you are not free. You are being coerced to follow someone. And again, if you cannot say no, if you are punished for not following along, then you should question, are you free? So, this is key to the problem reaction solution strategy, where there can be a problem that's created, such as COVID 19, and the perception needs to be totally controlled around that, which is why there's huge censorship around the narrative of what's going on. And there's a reason for this because if you control the narrative, you can guide people to a predictive reaction. And if people are allowing themselves to be manipulated, if they don't know themselves well enough, if they don't know how their mind works, if they cannot recognize when someone else is trying to manipulate them, then they will think that the solution that's presented is actually something that came to their mind and that they fully agree with and are on board with because they don't see any other options. That's making it so that the solution is desirable and it seems to be the only apparent one or the best apparent solution. And this is where the people themselves will demand their own enslavement. It's a very clever strategy and it's been used time and time again. Now, Article 6 mentions how everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Now, just to mention here, the law is supposed to uphold your basic human rights, and you're recognized as a person, a human being. And as they stated in Article 1, every human being is born with inherent dignity and equal rights. Okay. So, a corporation as well is treated as having the rights and obligations of a person. Counties and cities can also be treated as a person in the same manner as a corporation. That's just something to keep in mind if you are going a legal route in future. Article 7 talks about how all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. All right, so let's look at discrimination. Well, according to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, grounds for discrimination include race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, and so on. Now, what I want to look at specifically here is religion. Okay, because religion can actually include conscience. And on top of that, we have a new religion. right? It's simply a belief system. It's how you see the world, your belief structure. Scientism is the new religion. Many people have adopted this new religion without even realizing that they are part of a new religion. This is the belief in scientific experts or authorities who supposedly hold the answers and therefore should be obeyed. Follow the science, and the science says are common mantras. It does not require evidence to back up their claims, and they are trusting that nobody is going to investigate or look at what the actual science says. It's based on beliefs and dogmatic paradigms that refuse to acknowledge contrary evidence. Now, remember that the truth is not fragile. The truth can stand up to investigation and inquiry. It can stand up to criticism and to debate and argument, right? The truth does not have to deny looking at contrary views. And through our discourse with contrary views, we can reach the truth. But if no discourse is allowed, then there is dogma and there is a refusal to be challenged. A belief or a fear, especially one that is unfounded, can never justify taking away human rights. If you are fearful and you want to wear a mask, then that is your right. It is not your right, however, to make another wear a mask because you are afraid or you believe that it works. Article 8 states that everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals for acts violating the fundamental rights granted him by the Constitution or by law. Okay, so you have a right, we're going to take this in two parts, to an effective remedy by competent national tribunals. You can, through habeas corpus, defend your rights to an impartial judge and jury. And if that is not available to you, as suggested in the preamble of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, then you have the right to rebel against tyranny. Okay, and what they state here in the second part, the fundamental rights granted him by constitution or by law, that actually does not go along with Article 1 because your rights are not granted by constitution or law. They are recognized by those because all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience. They are not granted these by governing bodies or by documents. Ideally, governments and courts in free societies should basically protect our rights and work for the people who are a part of their systems. We compose the systems. We actually hold the power and the control if we choose to accept it. So, governments would be, in a free society, elected by persons who help to manage the running, or sorry, would be composed of elected persons who help to manage the running of a society by representing the wishes of the people they represent. The power comes from the people, not the official representative. I should say, not the official representative alone. Government officials must make sure that any bills or legislation do not violate inherent human rights. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, draws the line where government cannot cross. In Canada, they are violating this right now and using the excuse that they can put in charter statements on all of the bills and legislation that are violating our charter rights. You can have a look at this on the Government of Canada website and see all of the charter statements that have been used since COVID 19 started. Courts in a free society would have a duty to protect human rights and provide a measure to combat violations of those rights. If these are not in place, then we are not in a free society. Now, Article 9 states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. What has violated this are our border closures, the required self isolation, the isolation of nursing and long term care residents, and the quarantine camps. I'm going to play a little video here from Randy Hillier asking, oh, it looks like the video might be gone. So if you want to see this video, it was actually included in my part 2, investigating what's really going on. So we're going to move on to the next one. This is basically addressing the same issue from a Montreal litigator who turned vlogger. And I'll just play that here.
Secret COVID detention centers in Quebec.
Forced quarantine?
Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Viva Fry Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and people have been asking me to cover this situation for the last few weeks. On September 2nd, one Dr. Jacques Girard gave an interview that left more questions than answers. Now, just a brief intro for context. Dr. Jacques Girard is the Directeur de la Santé Publique de la Capitale Nationale.
English, do you speak it?
In English, that means the Director of Public Health for the Capitale Nationale, which is a region of Quebec near Quebec City that includes 6 boroughs or 6 other districts. And at first glance, you might be tempted to think that this is a purely local provincial problem, but trust me, the ramifications of this situation go well beyond our provincial border. So during this September 2nd, 2020 update on the COVID situation in the Capitale Nationale region of Quebec, this Dr. Girard, the Director of Public Health for that region, said some things that raised a lot of eyebrows. He suggested forced confinement in facilities, the location of which he would not disclose, forced collaboration with investigations. What he suggested raised a lot of eyebrows. I started getting a ton of emails to look into what he said, whether or not it was true, and whether or not, if true, it is legal. But before we get into any of that, you are going to hear the words straight from the proverbial horse's mouth. Now, it's all in French, and the translation is mine. I did my best. I think I'm pretty good, but don't attack me if something is not 100% accurate in the translation.
Although I think it is, because I'm pretty darn good at translating French to English.
The section of the interview is about 3.5 minutes long. I didn't want to edit it. I didn't want to be accused of having taken anything out of context, but give it a watch. It is fascinating, terrifying, jaw-dropping, eye-opening, any other qualifier you can think of.
Docteur Girard, avant de terminer, il y a une journaliste qui ne pouvait pas être présente ici qui demande brièvement est-ce que des ordonnances ont été émises à l'endroit des clients récalcitrants?
Okay, so we're just gonna
confirming that you can have forced arrests, forced detention, forced.
We're just going to skip what he said, but if you do want to see what he said, of course, you can look up this video on YouTube. You can also watch my part 2, but I want to listen now to what this lawyer is going to say about whether it's actually legal to take somebody against their will and hold them in an undisclosed location, as they have been doing in Quebec, for an unspecified amount of time without judicial oversight.
Compliance with investigations, failing which you can be put in an undisclosed location for up to 14 days. I am sure I'm not alone in the sentiment that these are not the hallmarks of a free and democratic society. These are the trademarks of a fascist and tyrannical society. But emotions and political anger aside, what is going on? Now, I have in fact done a video on Canada's Quarantine Act. If you haven't seen that video, go give it a watch. I'm going to link it right here. In that video, I went into the extreme powers the Quarantine Act gives to the government, and yes, it should terrify you that these are in fact the powers that the Quarantine Act gives to the government. Quarantine Act, an act to prevent the introduction and spread of communicable diseases. Purpose. The purpose of this act is to protect public health by taking comprehensive measures to prevent the introduction and spread of communicable diseases. And reading from Wikipedia, the Quarantine Act 2005 is an act of the Parliament of Canada which regulates the use of quarantine to prevent the introduction and spread of communicable diseases. Introduced in the aftermath of the 2002 to 2004 SARS outbreak, the act grants the ability to designate quarantine facilities, require health screenings upon upon arrival or exit of the country, and issue emergency orders that impose conditions or prohibitions on the entry of individuals or imports in order to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. It also imposes fines on those who disobey quarantine officers or quarantine orders. And as we have seen in previous vlogs, those fines can be excessive to say the least, and they can include imprisonment or fines of up to $750,000. And just to give you an idea of some of the powers that law confers onto authorities, let me just give you a few concrete examples from the law itself. Duty to provide information.
Duty.
Every traveler shall answer any relevant questions asked by a screening officer or quarantine officer and provide to the officer any information or record in their possession that the officer may reasonably require in the performance of a duty under this act. Compliance with measures. Every traveler shall comply with any reasonable measure ordered by a screening officer or quarantine officer for the purposes of preventing the introduction and spread of a communicable disease. Obligation to inform. A screening officer shall immediately inform a quarantine officer and follow any directive of that officer respecting the traveler if the screening officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that a traveler has or might have a communicable disease or is infested with vectors or has recently been in close proximity to a person who has or might have a communicable.
Now, I'm just going to take a pause here because I want you to note the language and when they use the term reasonable grounds. Now, we're going to talk about that burden of proof and reasonable grounds because that is important to remember.
Disease or is infested with vectors. For those of you who may not know what a vector is something through which the disease can travel. But check out this power when it comes to forced isolation. Isolation. The screening officer may, without directives from a quarantine officer, isolate the traveler individually or within a group until the traveler is assessed by a quarantine officer. Arrest without warrant. A peace officer may, at the request of a screening officer or quarantine officer, arrest without a warrant and bring to a quarantine officer any traveler who the peace officer has reasonable grounds to believe has refused to be isolated or refuses to comply with a measure under subsection 15.3.
Okay, so I'm not going to play the whole of this video. I would suggest you do look it out on YouTube, Forced Quarantine and Secret Facilities in Canada, Viva Frey vlog. But what's important to note here is that you can have pieces of legislation drawn up that actually do violate your human rights, and you then have every justification to challenge them, regardless of if it's a quarantine act, if it's already been laid down, you still have grounds to challenge this. And they must present their proof. They must disclose in discovery their proof to show that they have reasonable grounds and that they're justified. If they cannot present that proof, and on top of that, we're going to actually look at how your human rights cannot be overridden even if there is an emergency. Okay, so first there's burden of proof, justification, reasonable grounds, and then even with all of that, there are specific human rights that still cannot be overridden. So let's move on.
To comply with
Okay, Article 10 states that everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in the determination of his rights and obligations and of any criminal charge against him. Okay, so there's going to be more about this right. If your rights are violated, we already touched on this a little bit, that you need a recourse. You need to have that recourse. And if it's not available to you, you do have the right to rebel against tyranny. So you are entitled to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial trial, okay, of any criminal charge brought against you, and that if you are charged by violating the lockdown orders, the mask mandates, again, you have a right to recourse. And everyone who is charged with a penal offense has the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to law in a public trial at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defense. Okay, no one shall be held guilty of any penal offense on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a penal offense under national or international law at the time when it was committed. Nor shall a heavier penalty be imposed than the one that was applicable at the time the penal offense was committed. Article 12 states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, his family, his home, or correspondence, nor attacks upon his honor and reputation, and everyone has the right to protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Okay, the second part is kind of, can be taken for granted because, as I stated, the laws are there to protect your human rights, okay, the rights of everyone. And so they'll uphold all of these articles, or they should, ideally. If they don't, again, you have the right to challenge. Um, so let's take this in two parts, right? You have the right not to be subjected to arbitrary interference with your privacy. Now, it's being violated with the digital surveillance and monitoring, the censoring of posts on social media, that you've got the in-home quarantine check-ins, the mandatory testing, the sharing of medical information without consent, the contact tracing apps, having your biometric and medical data on a phone to allow you to fly in the which they're implementing in the UK and want to implement abroad, or to attend a concert, which Ticketmaster is implementing. Okay, so that is your bodily autonomy, your privacy of and health aspects, which again is security of the person. And then for your family and the decisions for your family, and that is being interfered with. That is being arbitrarily interfered with. And you have every grounds to fight that. That includes whether or not you say your children can be masked. Um, it is whether or not your children stay with you in your home if they determine that one of you is infected and that there's not enough space. And so now they must take away people because there's not enough space. So some of you will go to a quarantine facility. Again, you can argue that that is arbitrary interference. Okay, the second part is attacks upon the honor and reputation. And we're seeing this with slander, defamation against any person going against the official COVID narrative. Now, what's good is that we actually already have laws against slander and defamation, so you can combat that. We don't need to change the what free speech means, and there's movements for that, but that is censorship, and that should not be allowed in a free society. So, Article 13 states that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within borders of each state, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Now, what's violating this are the border closures and the limits on our movement, including how far away from home we can go. Um, in certain places, there are curfews so that you are not allowed to leave your home during certain times. And also limiting access for people to their personal private properties, such as summer homes. They could not go to their cabins, their cottages. And that is a violation of your right of freedom of movement and residence and your right to leave or return to a country. Everyone has the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, Article 18. And this right includes the freedom to change your religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in a community with others, and in public or private, to manifest your religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Okay, so again, scientism is the new religion. It's based on belief and nothing more. And if you want to believe that, you can go ahead and believe that. But you must also recognize that others who do not believe the same have that right. The freedom of conscience is included in your choice in medical matters to refuse or accept them. And we're going to address this when it comes to informed consent and medical ethics. Article 19 states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedoms to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. The censorship is violating this. The encourage public shaming and ostracization ostracization of people for not following along with the COVID narrative, for questioning it, for having a different belief, the violence that is being committed against people who say are not wearing a mask, or encouraging violence against two differing political parties, all of that violates your human right to the freedom of opinion and expression. Article 20 states that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and no one can be compelled to belong to an association. This is being violated by our limitations on social gatherings and the restrictions on protests. So we've seen that some protests have been encouraged and other ones have been fought, but everyone has the right to protest, the right to express their opinion, and they have the right to peaceful assembly and association. That means gatherings in their homes, gatherings in the park, and now what could be grounds for unlawful assembly is covered in the Criminal Code of Canada, which states that an unlawful assembly is an assembly of three or more persons who, with the intent to carry out any common purpose, assemble in such a manner or so conduct themselves when they are assembled as to cause persons in the neighborhood of the assembly to fear, on reasonable grounds, that they will A, disturb the peace tumultuously, or B, will by that assembly needlessly and without reasonable cause provoke other persons to disturb the peace tumultuously. Okay, again, this is the language of reasonable grounds. So what are the justifications for social distancing? Well, I covered this in part one, investigating the science, and there are no justifications for social distancing. Therefore, there are no reasonable grounds. It's important to remember that fear alone is not enough for reasonable grounds. Social distancing is a theory that was developed by a 15-year-old back during the Bush and Cheney administration, when the bioterror paradigm started to come into play and the groundwork for medical martial law was laid out in the US and other countries. No scientific evidence backs up social distancing, yet the CDC adopted the approach in 2007 as non pharmaceutical intervention. Right now, this year in 2020, is the first time it's being implemented, which means that you as a human being are part of a medical scientific experiment without your fully informed consent. So, Article 21, what's important about this article, it states in the third paragraph that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Okay, so this is important. And Article 22 states that everyone as a member of society has the right to Social Security and is entitled to realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. So this can encompass the forced lockdowns of businesses, which lost people jobs, had people evicted from their homes from loss of income, had more people becoming dependent on food banks. You're basically using your right to the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for your dignity and free development of your person. And it's the state that is taking them away from you, or to be more exact, the people in state. Article 23 says that everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Okay, so what we're looking at here is again the forced lockdown of businesses and the so called essential versus non essential businesses, which has no justification and violates your rights. And then the just and favorable conditions of work and protection against unemployment. If you refuse to wear a mask, if you refuse to social distance, these again are medical measures that need your informed consent, and you have the right of your conscience, which you are endowed with. If you are not allowed to express your human right of conscience, then they are also violating your right to just and favorable conditions of work if your business does not allow you to do that. And if your business says you can't work here because you can't wear a mask or you're not following these orders, these special orders which have no justification, then you are not protected against unemployment, and that again violates your human rights. We are all essential. Okay. Businesses do not need to shut down or reduce capacity. They chose to do so. They were actually coerced into doing so, made to believe that it was the law to do so. But that is not actually the case. And we're going to look at some of that with Rocco Galati in a minute. Businesses as well cannot enforce a medical mandate. Okay, if they are requiring their employees to wear a mask, they must supply workers with the education and the training on personal protective equipment. They also must make sure that that personal protective equipment meets occupational health and safety standards, which we're going to look into. And they must also make accommodations for workers who are exempt from medical mandates without discrimination. And that includes if they're being required to wear a mask and they can't do that in that position, to give them equal work for equal pay while there's an investigation into the issue by occupational health and safety. Okay, you cannot be deprived of the right to make a living. And there was no justifiable evidence to support closure and current restrictions on businesses. So let's have a listen to Rocco Galati, constitutional lawyer and creator of the Constitutional Rights Center, which is an excellent resource. And this is on the duties and rights of business owners unmasking under COVID.
Be clear. If a patron says, I'm exempt, you have absolutely no right to demand to prove it or show me a note or tell me what your exemption is and the details of the exemption. I'm Rocco Galati. I'm the Executive Director of the Constitutional Rights Center. After our initial newsletter and YouTube on masking rights for the members of the public, a lot of independent business owners since then have emailed us and phoned us requesting that I do a brief video to outline generally the duties and the rights of a business owner vis-a-vis their patrons and their employees in the context of masking. So the masking laws across the country are either by municipal bylaw or provincial ordinance, and they more or less are consistent. But the first thing you need to do is dig up the masking bylaw that applies to you, either by the city or the province. Now, business owners are required to ensure that they convey and to in fact ensure that people who come into their premises are masked. However, that's only half the law. The other half of the law, which is equally of force, is that there are exceptions and exemptions to the requirement to mask when they come into your business location. Those exemptions include medical, whether they be physical or psychological, physical problems with putting on a mask, given physical disabilities, and any of the grounds under the Human Rights Code. There are religions and creeds that find it offensive to wear a mask when they're dealing with people. And so those exemptions are permissible as exemptions to the masking laws. You as a business patron are not allowed to say to your patron, prove it. Show me medical note. What's your exemption? And you are not allowed to get the personal details of a person's medical or psychological details or get proof from a doctor to prove their exemption so they can frequent your establishment. That's generally barred by the various human rights codes in the provinces. Now, with respect to your employees, if an employee cites an exemption, depending on how you're structured, you have to respect it as well or accommodate that employee. So, for instance, you may accommodate them and have them work in an area where they don't come into contact with anyone and they are able to socially distance if you're concerned. So the duty of you to accommodate and the right of the employee to be accommodated is set out by provincial human rights legislation. And that's based on various grounds. Disability, creed, religion, conscious objection, all of that is set out in your provincial human rights code. So then after you determine which bylaw or provincial masking ordinance applies to you, you should also look at your human rights code in the province to see what the human rights basis of accommodation are in your province. And they tend to be pretty standard. Now, if you live in Ontario, and I'll use this as an example, but this is clearly the law in Ontario. On October 3rd, 2020, Ontario enacted Regulation 364/20/20 pursuant to the Reopening Ontario, a Flexible Response to COVID-19 Act of 2020 from the Ontario legislature. And this regulation is a regulation passed pursuant to that legislation. Section 2, sub-bracket 4 of that regulation deals with masking on a provincial level. So no matter where you are now in Ontario, this law applies, and in our opinion at the Constitutional Rights Centre, prevails over any municipal bylaw. And that is any municipal bylaw that contradicts or in any way violates this cabinet regulation from the provincial legislature is in violation of this regulation. The emergency was called pursuant to emergency legislation. These regulations are the masking requirements pursuant to that legislation. No employer is permitted to go fishing in some other act that has nothing to do with COVID and pretend to bypass this provincial ordinance under the guise of another act. And what in Ontario, what this provincial ordinance says under section 2 sub 4 is that the person responsible for the business shall ensure that every person in the indoor area of the premises is masked. However, there are exceptions enumerated under this subsection that include a child who's under 2 years old doesn't need to mask. Certain schools are exempted at certain ages. And there's a number of exemptions. And the ones I would like to highlight that really apply to business owners are: you're exempt if you have a medical condition that inhibits your ability to wear a mask or face covering, under sub G of subsection 4. Under H, if you're unable to put on or remove the mask or face covering without assistance of another person. I needs to temporarily remove their mask or face covering while in an indoor area to receive service that requires removal, engage in an athletic or fitness activity, to consume food or drink, or as may be necessary for the purpose of health and safety, if they need to remove their mask. You're also exempt if you're being accommodated in accordance with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And this one is very important. K, 4K, you're exempted if you're being reasonably accommodated in accordance with the Human Rights Code. So read your Human Rights Code and what the reasonable accommodations are under the code, which include bases of accommodation above and beyond medical exemptions. And then with respect to, that's with respect to your patrons. With respect to employees, there's a further exemption in that if one of your employees performs work for the business or organization in an area that is not accessible to members of the public and is able to maintain a physical distance of at least 2 meters from every other person, they're not required to mask. So if when your employee says, "Listen, I work over there. I'm never closer than 6 meters to anybody. I'm not serving the tables in the cafe. Let's say they're in the kitchen or something. They're not required to mask at all for any reason as your employee. So what's important under subsection 6 of section 2 of this provincial regulation, and I'll read it for you because it's very important. It drives home and codifies what the law was before anyway. It says, for greater certainty, it is not necessary for a person to present evidence to the person responsible for a business or place that they are entitled to any of the exceptions set out in subsection 4. So to be clear, if a patron says, I'm exempt, you have absolutely no right to demand to prove it or show me a note or tell me what your exemption is and the details of the exemption. Nobody has to show you evidence of their exemption. And that leads me to the final point of this. And I've had a lot of people email me and call me and ask me, well, I'm a private business owner. It's private property. Can't I make up my own rules because it's private? And the answer to that is no. While the property and the business may be privately owned, it is licensed either under municipal or provincial regulations. It's licensed to conduct business under whatever business it is. When you conduct a business pursuant to license, whether it's municipal or provincial, for instance, even me, practicing law, I'm licensed by the Law Society through provincial legislation. When you provide service or goods under a license, and you're open to the public, that's an invitation of any member of the public to come in and ask for buy your goods and services. Now, once you're licensed and your premises are an open invitation to the public, you are bound by all municipal laws and provincial laws that apply to your business, whether it's privately owned or not. So you are bound by the masking laws and their exceptions. You are bound by the Human Rights Code. So, no, you can't just say it's my private property, get lost if you don't mask. That's a contravention of the law. And any contravention of the law can see you charged under the Provincial Offences Act and sued by your patron or employee. And so, in fact, the Constitutional Rights Centre is developing templates for such lawsuits for those who have had their rights violated and those who choose to sue as self-represented plaintiffs. And so I hope that small business owners and business owners in general have found this YouTube presentation, this newsletter, useful. And thank you for...
Okay, so that's looking at the duties and rights of businesses with regard to the mask mandates. And we're going to
listening.
look now at mandating mask mandates and flesh that out a bit more because there is definitely a lot to this story. It's multifaceted. So requirements for employers, there are requirements for employers who are requiring their employees to wear personal protective equipment, and I'm going to show you an example of that with the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Newfoundland and Labrador. Exemptions, when we're talking about medical exemptions, if you looked at my part one investigating the science behind masks, yes, there are adverse side effects to wearing masks. And there's a reason why the masks need to be investigated and meet occupational health and safety regulations if an employer is requiring their employees to wear them, and that's because there can be adverse side effects. Now, every single human being has a valid medical exemption because putting something over your nose and mouth blocks your intake of oxygen and causes you to breathe in CO2. It also causes you to breathe in the particulates of what that mask is made of. And depending on the mask, some can be a lot worse than others. And it also causes you to breathe in other things that are released in your exhale, which can cause latent pathological viruses uh, to basically it's a high risk of infection. So there's something called pleomorphism, and I hope to get into that when I do some more videos, but you increase your risk of infection. And there are people who have developed rashes and eczema on their face from putting the material on there. So every human being has a valid medical exemption. We also have a valid exemption when it comes to our human rights, which includes a conscientious objection, and that is a fundamental human right that cannot be overridden. Okay, exemptions include, there is no scientific facts. There are no scientific facts to support the mask mandates. And therefore, the effectiveness of wearing a mask is based on belief, and religious freedom is fundamental. So the question is, how many employers are lawfully following occupational health and safety regulations regarding respiratory protection? So let's have a look. So here's the Occupational Health and Safety Act of Newfoundland and Labrador, and you can look up your own for your province. But when we go down to respiratory protective equipment, in the instructions, it states that an employer shall ensure that a worker who wears PPE is adequately instructed in the correct use, the limitations, and assign maintenance duties for the equipment to be used. Where required, an employer shall establish, implement, and maintain and revise where necessary a written respiratory protection program in accordance with CSA standard Z94.4, selection, use, and care of respirators. Okay, so that is talking specifically about respirators, that second part, but when we get into this respiratory protection, you're looking at masking being involved too. And they state where a worker is or may be exposed to either an oxygen deficient atmosphere or harmful concentrations of air contaminants, atmospheric contamination should then be prevented to the extent practicable by accepted engineering controls. And when engineering or other controls are not practicable, appropriate respiratory protection equipment shall be used in accordance with this section. So what happens with occupational health and safety if people need to be masked up in a facility? First thing that they do, like say surgeons who are operating, there is certain engineering developed in that room to improve oxygen flow, so that they get better oxygen flow. There's certain things that are developed around there, and then the equipment itself is analyzed and checked to make sure that it performs the way that it should perform, that if there's any adverse effects that can happen, and then you have to look at the individual as well. And there are individuals who just cannot deal with that oxygen deprivation, no matter how small that it may be, in that ideal environment. As stated in the video with Rocco Galati, people who are doing physical activity can take off their masks, and that's very important because, again, you need that oxygen intake, but you're blocking it when you put the mask on, and that's actually hazardous to your health. So Respiratory protection equipment shall be provided by an employer when the equipment is necessary to protect the health of the worker, and they shall also make sure that the safety mechanisms are in place in case a worker has any adverse side effects, and they shall select and provide appropriate respiratory protection equipment based on the respiratory hazard to which the worker is exposed and the workplace and user factors that affect the performance and reliability of the equipment. The equipment referred to in subsection 1 shall be certified by the National Institution of Occupational Safety and Health and used in compliance with the conditions of its certification. An employer shall identify and evaluate the respiratory hazards in the workplace, and the evaluation shall include an employee's potential exposure to respiratory hazards and an identification of the contaminant's chemical composition and physical state. Okay, again, we need the evidence, we need the proof, it needs to be stated, you need to check what the masks are made of, if they are certified by National Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, and so on. Okay. You have the right to refuse to wear masks. And this is because masks are not safe and effective. They are physically and psychologically harmful. And if you refuse to wear a mask and your employer demands you wear a mask to keep your job, you have the right to refuse work. Then what would happen is an investigation by occupational health and safety would occur, and your employer during that investigation must provide you with equal work for equal pay. Here is the right of the worker to refuse work for Newfoundland and Labrador. That states just that, and you can look up your own in your province. Okay. So let's look at what Rocco Galati says on the individual rights and masking.
When a store refuses to let you enter despite your declaration of a medical exemption, they're usually in breach of the bylaw. Most, if not all, masking ordinances provide a medical exemption and accommodation. Hi, my name is Rocco Galati. I'm the Executive Director of the Constitutional Rights Center, and this second newsletter, as promised, is going to be dealing with your rights in the context of masking. However, before I get into the issue of masking under the COVID measures, I would like to just make a few comments. Since the launch of our website 2 weeks ago on September 1st, the response has been great, and we thank everyone who's gone to our website and who's taken an interest in our work, and we encourage you to continue that. The center concentrates on litigation of test cases and systematic cases that apply to a lot of people at large. We've received hundreds per week of phone calls and emails conveying to us and relating to us your personal ordeals and incidents of not having your rights respected in a particular visit to a store or to a public venue where you're required to be masked, and although you have a medical exemption, that was not respected. The center litigates. We do court cases. Information about your rights and conveying of information of your constitutional rights and the COVID, in the context even of the COVID, is conveyed through our website and through these newsletters. We cannot possibly, although we sympathize with your personal incidents and ordeals, we cannot possibly service and take individual action for each one of you. That's not the function of the Constitutional Rights Center. We provide you with information, and knowledge of your constitutional rights, and certain groups who are able to organize, we represent on a broad scale in launching test cases and systematic cases. However, that's not to say we will not provide you with products in the very near future to be able to take your own steps to vindicate your rights with respect to things, with respect to the violation of your own rights in a particular circumstance. So the types of cases beyond the case that's already filed in the Ontario Superior Court that the Centre is developing and working on launching, for example, is that we're looking at filing a similar broad challenge in British Columbia. We're planning to sue school boards who've enacted restrictive measures that violate the provincial measures and do not respect the Human Rights Code. We plan to take on the medical profession and the regulatory body for illegally directing its doctors not to provide medical notes when required by their patients, and also the federal transport minister and transportation requirements of masking on federal planes, trains, and ferries where the medical exemptions are not being respected. So moving on to the issue of masking, there's three particular contexts that I will review with masking. The first, and the outlining of these contexts I'm taking from the volume of emails the Centre has received. So the first scenario is you visit a store, they tell you to wear a mask, you declare your medical exemption, they don't care, they don't respect it, and they won't let you enter the store. So most masking laws are by way of municipal and county bylaws and ordinances from the medical officers in those counties. When a store refuses to let you enter despite your declaration of a medical exemption, they're usually in breach of the bylaw. Most, if not all, masking ordinances provide a medical exemption and accommodation. So when the store owner refuses to let you in the store after you declare your exemption, the store owner is actually in breach of the bylaw on two planes. First of all, the bylaw requires that they respect your exemption, and therefore they're breaching the bylaw. Secondly, they're breaching the Human Rights Code, discriminating against you in providing a service or a good based on disability. So, with respect to that scenario, the immediate recourse you have is you can phone a bylaw officer and demand that that store owner or employee get charged under the municipal bylaw in not respecting that part of the bylaw that entitles you to enter without a mask if you have a medical exemption. You can also call the Human Rights Commission and make a complaint. Those are your two immediate remedies. If neither the bylaw officer nor the Human Rights Commission takes your complaint, you can then sue in small claims court. And I'll have more about that and more detailed information about that at the end of outlining the three scenarios of masking. The second most common query that we've had by way of email is masking in the context of employment. So your employer says to you, you got a mask. You say, I have a medical exemption. I need an accommodation. Under the Human Rights Code, the employer is required to accommodate your disability for whatever medical reason you cannot wear a mask. That means the employer has to either find your work or create an environment in which you do not need to mask to do your work. If the employer refuses to do that and fires you as a result, again, you have two remedies. One, you can make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission based on discrimination, based on disability, and you can also sue that employer in wrongful dismissal. The third area that I want to cover, in which we have also had a lot of emails and questions about, is masking with respect to the school reopening that just happened in early September. Now, education under our constitutional framework in Canada is strictly an exclusive provincial jurisdiction. The provincial government has full and exclusive jurisdiction over education. And the provincial legislature is the ultimate lawmaker by way of legislation under the Education Act, and the provincial executive through cabinet, through its ministers, is also the ultimate authority on policy and guidelines. In Ontario, for example, the province of Ontario issued its education guidelines for the reopening of schools. And the Ontario government said that JK to grade 3, you don't need to mask. Grade 4 to grade 12, you're required to mask. But they also, the Ontario government, the Minister of Education, also stipulated in the policy that the schools must make reasonable accommodation for students, meaning if they have a medical exemption, they do not have to mask. Now, past the Ministry of Education, below the Ministry of Education in Ontario, the schools are divided in different school board districts. What has happened is that in some school board districts, for instance, the Toronto Public School District Board and the Halton Public School District Board, they have actually taken what the Centre sees as illegal action by passing bylaws that contradict the provincial ministerial directives under the Education Act and the declared emergency. And that is, they have mandated that you need to mask if you're in JK to grade 3. And furthermore, they are not respecting medical exemptions. They're not accommodating. Even in cases where parents have produced medical notes from the student's doctor saying they need an exemption, those boards have had the audacity to leave the ultimate decision on whether the doctor's assessment of the medical condition is valid or not to the principal of the schools. That's illegal. And so we plan to sue these trustees in both school boards, as well as the individual principals of the schools who are purporting to disregard the medical assessment of the student's doctor and who purport to make mandatory masking for JK to grade 3. This is clearly unlawful in the view of the Constitutional Rights Center. So we will be taking appropriate action. So in the context of masking, again, if your school principal does not respect the medical exemption, again, make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. The bylaws of a school board are still subject to the Human Rights Code. And whether or not those bylaws are properly enacted, they cannot refuse to accommodate under the code. So now what I want to talk about next is the measures that I have just discussed. You will notice I did not talk about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The breaches of your rights under these three scenarios are a breach under the statutory framework that we're dealing with. I did not mention the charter, any charter violations, because the charter violations are the subject of the statement of claim that we filed in the Ontario Superior Court, which we will be dealing with by way of injunction on the masking issues under the charter, not under the statute, but under the charter at its basic substantive level. In the coming weeks, also with respect to the particularized masking scenarios that you through email have been relating to us, in order to provide a means by which you can vindicate and enforce your own rights in a way that's realistic and practical. We hope to develop, roll out, and make available on our website a small claims court templates for you to be able to essentially fill in blanks when encountering one of the above noted scenarios and problems where you've had difficulty negotiating your rights not to be masked if you have a medical exemption. And so it would work something like this. You go to a store, you're denied entry, you declare your medical exemption, they refuse to recognize it, you call a bylaw officer, they refuse to charge the store, you call the Human Rights Commission, and you do not get any redress from the Human Rights Commission. The small claims court template would allow you to basically fill in and put yourself down as the plaintiff, the store owner, the municipality that refuses to enforce the exemption under the bylaw, and the Human Rights Commission as defendants, jointly and severably, for denying your statutory rights. So I'm asking at this point for you, in a very simple, short email, to convey whether or not you would be interested in this type of tool, and would be interested that we develop.
Okay, so that tool, I believe, is going to be made available. They got enough feedback on that, and that should be something to look into.
Amount.
So one of the other things to consider is that the mask mandates and enforcement of them are actually criminal negligence, reckless endangerment, and child abuse. And you can approach this from a self-defense aspect. If you want to look into this more, I would recommend looking up standforthee.com. It's stand and the number 4 and then THEE.com. And they are pursuing that form of self-defense and charging for reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, and child abuse. Criminal negligence, according to the Criminal Code of Canada, states that everyone is criminally negligent who, A, in doing anything, or B, in omitting to do anything that it is his duty to do, and for this purposes, duty means a duty imposed by law, shows wanton or reckless disregard for the lives or safety of other persons. So if it is part of your duty as a police officer or a peace officer or a health official to take into account the informed consent and the safety of those you are recommending action for, such as medical mandates and mask mandates. If you do not actually look into the adverse effects of these things, you can be criminally negligent, showing wanton or reckless disregard for the lives or safeties of the persons. Informed consent is required for medical intervention. The burden of proof regarding safety and efficacy of a purported health claim is incumbent upon the person making the claim, and they must provide valid evidence that masks do as they claim, that social distancing does as it's claimed, and so on. They must also be transparent about the adverse effects. Each person subjected to such a claim must also look at the evidence presented and decide for themselves whether or not it is satisfactory and coincides with his or her conscience. Okay, if they are in disagreement, they can present their own evidence and there can be discourse between that. If it ends up being something challenged in court, each side will have to produce their own evidence and discovery and be put in front of an impartial judge and jury. Okay. So Article 25, back to our UN Declaration of Human Rights, states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. Okay, so we're again talking about a standard of living that's adequate for the health and well-being of the person and his family. And that includes what's provided to people in long-term care homes and nursing homes, if they still have their human rights or if they're being violated. It includes people whose businesses are being told to close or people who are losing their jobs because they are not wearing a mask and so on. In regard to Article 26, there have been parents who are opting to take their children out of school and to homeschool them, and there's measures being taken to stop this from happening. And actually, it is a human right for parents to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. And everyone has the right to an education, but parents have a prior right to choose the type. Article 29 states in section 2 of that in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. So let's look into this and examine what this means. What limitations can you have on your freedoms? To the extent that inherent freedoms can be limited, it is only when actions taken by an individual infringe upon the inherent rights of another. These laws are put in place to protect freedoms inherent in all humans that are coexisting together. So I just want you to stop for a moment and think about what are some examples where limitations instituted by law are necessary, and why do you think they are necessary? And then what freedoms do you think should never be limited, and why? You can take a moment and pause or write those questions down and really think about them for yourself. Now, Article 30 at the end states that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. Okay, that's a pretty definitive statement. It doesn't say that you can infringe upon these rights because of emergency or because you feel that it's necessary. And there's a lot of um, there's a lot that you need to look into if you're going to decide to say, hey, I'm going to take away your rights. There needs to be proof, transparency, evidence, debate, um, and so on. Now, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, put out by the UN, does talk about a public emergency in Article 4, stating that in a time of public emergency which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of its officially proclaimed, of which is officially proclaimed, okay, then the states parties present to the covenant may take measures derogating from their obligations under the present covenant to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. Okay, now this is talking about this covenant. It doesn't say derogating the human rights from the Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, now provided it says that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligations under international law and do not involve discrimination. But no derogation from Articles 6, 7, 8, 11, 15, 16, and 18 may be made under this provision. So we're going to look at those and see what exactly those articles state. And we're also going to look at the Emergency Act of Canada and see whether or not that states it can override the Charter and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. One thing to take into account when we're talking about limitations that can be put on people's individual freedoms is this concept called the harm principle. And you can find this on Wikipedia. Now, the harm principle holds that the actions of individuals should only be limited to prevent harm to other individuals. John Stuart Mill articulated this principle in On Liberty, where he argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. An equivalent was earlier stated in France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789 as liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which ensure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. So what's important to note here is preventing harm to others. Now, this needs to be proven. Again, you need the burden of proof. And what we'll find here with COVID-19 is that there is a huge lack in that. Now, what is harm? Okay, this is also important to consider. What do we mean by harm? So, for example, when a person reacts out of anger and they do something because they're angry, not only are others harmed, but the person who's acting in anger is also harmed. When we talk about having laws to keep people in order, what we forget is that life itself provides the feedback to every action we choose to take. We may not be fully conscious of it, but it's always there. For example, when we decide to nurture thoughts that are negative, this actually influences our perception and how we behave. It also influences the chemical makeup in our body. So when we're angry or we're stressed or we are jealous or we're depressed, that has a direct effect on the genes that are expressed in our body. It can promote more genes that promote inflammatory reactions in the body, which changes the chemical makeup in our body and then changes the way things happen in the human body and also changes our moods because those are all, everything's interconnected. So it'll change our moods, which will then go back and feed back into how we think and go back into how we behave, and all of that feeds back into itself. Okay, so the consequences are actually immediate. And like I said, we may not be fully conscious of it, but they're there. Ultimately, we are each only responsible for controlling our own bodies and life choices, no one else's. Knowing this helps one to see how to most effectively address a situation when another is causing harm. And this is where the nuances between what is the right and wrong thing to do happen, because only a person in a specific situation can see what is available to them as far as options and what in their perception could be the right thing to do. And then for an impartial jury, if it comes to that, to figure out whether the person intentionally caused harm, they need to hear that person's side and look at the evidence and try to be objective. Now, the Criminal Code of Canada gives a definition for bodily harm, and it states that bodily harm means any hurt or injury to a person that interferes with the health or comfort of the person, and that is more than merely transient or trifling in nature. The other important thing to consider is that we all have rights to take risks. Generally, all humans pretty much want to live and not die. And we act according to the knowledge that each of us has based on our unique life experience. Mistakes are likely to happen when we're ignorant. But even when we do have some knowledge, we can never know everything, and life is never free from risk. Based on the variability and uncertainty that's inherent in science and inherent in life in general, this alone, science, should not be the sole influence on deciding policies. If human freedoms are to be removed, then the policy needs to be re-examined. Now, the Emergencies Act of Canada, 1985, is an act to authorize the taking of special temporary measures to ensure safety and security during national emergencies and to amend other acts in consequence thereof. It states that whereas the safety and security of the individual, the protection of the values of the body politic, and the preservation of the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of the state are fundamental obligations of government, and whereas the fulfillment of those obligations in Canada may be seriously threatened by a national emergency, and in order to ensure safety and security during such an emergency, the Governor and Council should be authorized, subject to the supervision of Parliament, to take special temporary measures that may not be appropriate in normal times. And whereas the Governor and Council, in taking such temporary measures, would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights, and must have regard to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly with respect to those fundamental rights that are not to be limited or abridged even in a national emergency. Now, I want to play this video from Jacob Bronowski. It's a clip from a BBC series called The Ascent of Man, and this talks about the dark side of certainty.
There are two parts to the human dilemma. One is the belief that the end justifies the means. That push-button philosophy, that deliberate deafness to suffering, has become the monster in the war machine. The other is the betrayal of the human spirit, the assertion of dogma that closes the mind and turns a nation, a civilization, into a regiment of ghosts, obedient ghosts or tortured ghosts. It's said that science will dehumanize people and turn them into numbers. That's false, tragically false. Look for yourself. This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. When people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is what men do when they aspire to the knowledge of gods. Science is a very human form of knowledge. We are always at the brink of the known. We always feel forward for what is to be hoped. Every judgment in science stands on the edge of error and is personal. Science is a tribute to what we can know although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell. I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken. I owe it as a scientist to my friend Leo Szilard. I owe it as a human being to the many members of my family who died here, to stand here as a survivor and a witness. We have to cure ourselves of the itch for absolute knowledge and power. We have to close the distance between the push-button order and the human act. We have to touch people.
So that I hope you keep with you, because as stated in the preamble of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, when we remove human rights that are the basis for freedom, justice, and peace, we commit acts of barbarity. We give ourselves justifications that we are right. We are convicted because it goes along with the dogma that we have adopted. We have not stopped to question what are the possible harms? Who is being harmed? What can be avoided if possible? We do not investigate. We do not respect the individual, and therefore we commit atrocities. We repeat history, but we don't have to. Now I'm going to show some videos from Constitutional Attorney John Carpe from the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms here in Canada on the fear-mongering that's been going on in the media.
The facts are coming in. The COVID-19 death predictions of governments are proving to be wild exaggerations that have inflicted unnecessary stress, anxiety, and fear on millions of people. In March, the United Kingdom and other countries listened to Dr. Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, who predicted as many as 510,000 COVID deaths in the United Kingdom and 2,200,000 deaths in the United States. These numbers were relied upon by the United Kingdom and governments around the world to justify lockdowns that violate our freedoms and human dignity and have pushed tens of millions of people into unemployment and poverty. More than 2 months later, at the end of May, COVID deaths are a tiny fraction of what Dr. Ferguson predicted. In the UK, the US, Italy, and globally, COVID deaths are within the same range as deaths from the annual flu. The annual flu kills between 300,000 and 640,000 people every year. Don't take my word for it. Look it up yourself on government websites, Centre for Disease Control, British, Italian, and other health authorities. It appears that governments in Canada also relied on Dr. Ferguson's predictions as the basis for restricting our charter freedoms to move, travel, associate, assemble, and worship. In Alberta, for example, Premier Jason Kenney warned that as many as 32,000 Albertans could die of COVID. And here we are towards the end of May, and 138 Albertans have died, not 32,000. Not only were the death predictions wildly inaccurate, but claims by politicians and chief medical officers that COVID poses a serious threat to young and healthy people are also demonstrably false. The Alberta government's own data, and data from governments around the world, show that COVID-19 is a serious threat to people who are elderly and already very sick, not the rest of the population. Children and people under 20 have a greater chance of death by lightning than from COVID. For adults under 60, your chance of dying from COVID is smaller than your chance of dying while driving to work. That is, if you're lucky enough to have a job, after what the lockdown has done to our economy. Still, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney continues to compare COVID-19 to the Spanish flu of 100 years ago, which killed between 20 and 100 million adults around the world, most of them ages 20 to 40. This is willful blindness to facts or deliberate fear-mongering. Politicians are continuing to violate our charter freedoms with the lockdown, based on fear-mongering, not on facts. The facts are available. You owe it to yourself to check them out. I'm John Carpe. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so let's go to the next one about the media's role in this.
Media are driving the fear that has turned lockdowns into permanent violations of our rights and freedoms and human dignity. Media do this by hyping the number of COVID-19 cases without providing relevant context. For the sake of truth and accuracy, the oath used in the courtroom asks the witness to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Likewise, news reports on COVID cases should provide the whole truth with all of the relevant context. Even a news story that contains no errors and no lies becomes misleading when vital, crucial, relevant facts are omitted. The COVID-19 death data, which is readily available on government websites, makes it abundantly clear that the latest COVID cases in August, September, October are proving harmless to more than 99% of the population. Our media makes no mention of the fact that COVID-19 deaths are down to a mere trickle of their peak in April and May. You won't catch the media reporting on COVID-19 deaths in Canada in September being only a tenth of the death rate in April. There is no second wave of COVID-19 deaths, and the government's own data shows this, for anyone who takes the time to look it up. When trumpeting new cases, media say little about the way the PCR test is set at a level of cycles designed to pick up even the tiniest traces of viral RNA, which could even be from a past illness or unrelated cold virus. Further, media usually do not mention that governments are conducting far more tests than they did a few months ago. Unsurprisingly, the more testing that is done, the greater the number of cases. Media seeks to keep matters simple and scary. Fortunately, on October 4th, 2020, leading doctors and scientists issued the Great Barrington Declaration, which calls for focused protection of the vulnerable rather than current lockdown policies, which are harming so many people. More than 30,000 medical doctors, epidemiologists, immunologists, professors of medicine, health economists, biostatisticians, microbiologists, oncologists, and infectious disease experts from around the globe have signed this declaration, calling for an end to the lockdowns. And, to the media's credit, they have reported on the Great Barrington Declaration. But the misleading reporting on cases needs to stop. I'm John Carpe. Thanks for listening.
Okay, and our last video from Mr. Carpe is on the unfounded second wave panic.
They cracked down on restaurants again starting Thursday, October the 1st. So they announced in the last 2 or 3 days of September that because of the increased numbers of cases, which of course you get when you do tens of thousands of tests, the more tests you do, the more cases you find. So starting October 1st, the decimation and crucifixion of the restaurant industry and hotels and conferences and bars and gyms, as well as a crackdown on the civil liberties of the people in Quebec, that you cannot have friends or family come over to your house, which is just a huge violation of human dignity and of a fundamental freedom that you can hang out with friends, hang out with family members. So that very harsh, and yet the number of deaths, it's the same in Quebec, in Ontario, in every Canadian province, in every jurisdiction. We saw deaths go from zero in January, or at least zero recorded deaths. I mean, there may have been COVID deaths in January that we don't know about. But in terms of government data, he has zero deaths in January, zero or very few in February. And then the floodgates start to open slowly in March, and you get some deaths in March. And then in April and May, you get large numbers of deaths for about 2 months. And then in June, it drops. And in July, it drops more. And in August, it drops more. Even in Quebec, the media, which I think are contributing to the hysteria, the media in some of their reporting actually said, okay, so we have, 500 new cases, but 2 hospitalizations, 0 deaths. 400 cases, 1 hospitalization, 0 deaths. 700 cases, 3 hospitalizations, 3 deaths. There's no increase in the number of deaths beyond 0 or 1.
Okay, so, and I would recommend to understand the cases and the death reporting, the misreporting, how the PCR tests are not diagnostic tools, and so on, to look at my Investigating the Truth Part 1 series or Part 1 video on the science. So, Article 20, we're going to jump to that one in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, states that any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. Now, what we're seeing here with the fear mongering is so also the advocacy of incitement to discriminate, provoking hostility and violence to people who are standing up against the COVID narrative, people who are not wearing masks, people who are not social distancing. This article has been violated repeatedly by government officials and mainstream media with regards to COVID and with regards to other situations that are happening right now, deliberately inciting discrimination, hostility, and violence. They're also encouraging snitching, shaming, and ostracizing, and intentional misleading has occurred with the mask signs that are being posted that say masks are required, and yet they do not state the exemptions, which thereby incites discrimination, hostility, and violence because people are so afraid and they're not aware that exemptions exist, and they're not aware of the data in context. So I'm going to look now at another thing that can apply to this from the Canadian Criminal Code, and that is something called a hoax regarding terrorist activity. So this says that everyone commits an offense who, without lawful excuse and with intent to cause any person to fear death, bodily harm, substantial damage to property, or serious interference with the lawful use or operation of property, conveys or causes or procures to be conveyed information that in all the circumstances is likely to cause a reasonable apprehension that terrorist activity is occurring or will occur without believing the information to be true, or commits an act that in all circumstances is likely to cause a reasonable apprehension that terrorist activity is occurring or will occur without believing that such activity is occurring or will occur. Now, this is an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not exceeding 5 years. And what we're looking at is the institution of the bioterror paradigm. And the new terrorists are actually being shown as asymptomatic carriers who have a bioterror threat, a virus. So by um, causing people to fear death, bodily harm, and so on, by conveying information of a bioterror threat that is not actually accurate, could apply to this hoax regarding terrorist activity. Now, another one that I want to mention for the Canadian Criminal Code is a section on corruption and disobedience. And this can apply to corruption of government officials, your health ministers, and your police police officers, and you can go to the Police Services Board. And when you present evidence, such as stand for thee, if you present evidence that there is criminal negligence, reckless endangerment, and child abuse, you can also present evidence that the media and the governments are implementing lockdown orders in violation of your human rights without any transparency or justification, no evidence, and you have all the evidence to show that there is no emergency. Now, that shows that a crime is being committed, and if the police do not act, then they could also be charged with corruption and disobedience. So have a look at that. And now we'll go back to that International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and look at the other articles that cannot be overridden even if an emergency is called. So Article 7 states that no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. In particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. Remember this, this is very important. If you are not fully informed, if there is information that is being censored or omitted, then you are not giving free consent to these medical mandates, to the vaccinations that they want to provide you with, to the social distancing experiment, and so on. Informed consent is a really important concept. And following the Nuremberg trial of 23 doctors accused of improper experiments on human subjects, a 10-point code was drawn up by American judges presiding over the military tribunal. The first principle stated, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And this means that the person should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion. And the person should also have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. In Canadian medical law, they also talk about informed consent. So frequently, parents find themselves coerced or bullied into a decision to vaccinate their children, and now we're seeing it with the mask mandates as well. And it can often be against their own better judgment and without the opportunity to adequately weigh all the risks. This is information you can look up from Vaccine Choice Canada. Now, vaccination is an invasive medical procedure and is subject to the legal principles enshrined in Canadian medical law. But you'll also see how other medical measures, even preventive ones, are subject to informed consent as well. The Canadian medical law states that every individual has the right to information on material risks and the fundamental right of persons to be free from unwanted physical interference. Medical care is wrongful and a battery unless the patient has given consent to it. It is an essential prerequisite to the provision of medical services, and this is included in medical ethics. Furthermore, the patient must understand the risks no matter how statistically insignificant these may be. So the informed consent ethic is enshrined in numerous international treaties to which Canada is signatory. The Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights is one such treaty. Article 6, consent in the treaty reads as follows. Any preventive, diagnostic, and therapeutic medical intervention is only to be carried out with the prior, free, and informed consent of the person concerned based on adequate information. The consent should, where appropriate, be expressed and, this is quite important, may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice. Now, Article 6 states that in the international covenant that every human being has the inherent right to life, and this right shall be protected by law, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his right. Well, in the open letter from the World Doctors Alliance that formed around what's happening with COVID, they stated that blanket do not resuscitate orders were imposed on thousands of people without their consent, nor the consent of their families, and that this is both unlawful and immoral and led to unnecessary deaths in care homes. Article 8 states that no one shall be held in slavery and no one shall be held in servitude. And we'll refer back to what I said in the UN Declaration of Human Rights with that. No one shall be imprisoned merely on the ground of an inability to fulfill a contractual obligation. So by not self-isolating at home, you are conscientiously objecting to an illegal medical mandate that requires full evidential transparent justification and the informed consent of the individual, and therefore you should not be imprisoned because of that. Or what we're talking about these days is being unlawfully held in an undisclosed quarantine facility. Article 15 states that no one shall be held guilty of any criminal offense on any account on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a criminal offense at the time when it was committed, nor shall a heavier penalty be imposed than the one that was applicable at the time when the criminal offense was committed. If subsequent to the commission of the offense, provision is made by law for the imposition of the lighter penalty, the offender shall benefit thereby. So nothing in this article shall prejudice the trial and punishment of any person for any act or omission which at the time when it was committed was criminal according to the general principles of law recognized by the community of nations. So what's important to take away from here, this applies as well as to a similar article in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, is how you should not receive a heavier penalty imposed than the one that was applicable at the time of the criminal offense. And also you can refer back to how you cannot be held guilty until you have had due recourse with a judge and jury. Article 16 states that everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, which we covered already. Article 18, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. No one shall be subject to coercion, which would impair his freedom. And freedom to manifest your religion or beliefs is included. And the states party to the President Covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents and, when applicable, legal guardians to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. Okay. And according to the Criminal Code of Canada, you can look up the defense of the person, which gives you the right to basically defend yourself. So a person is not guilty of an offense if they believe on reasonable grounds that force is being used against them or another person, or that a threat of force is being made against them or another person, and B, the act that constitutes the offense is committed for the purpose of defending or protecting themselves or the other person from that use of threat or of force. Okay, so this is something you can look into because yes, the government is using coercion to get everybody to obey the lockdowns and the mask mandates. Coercion is a form of force. There is also the threat of fines, imprisonment, quarantine camps in undisclosed locations, the closure of businesses, and so on. So you do have the right to defend yourself. Masking children, as I went through already, reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, and child abuse, all the scientific evidence demonstrates the harms both physically and psychologically in wearing masks. The physical harms are paramount in children who require more oxygen due to brain development and greater metabolism. Mask mandates are based on belief and therefore come under religious expression, and medical recommendations require fully informed consent. Therefore, there is no informed consent here. Now, one of the great videos I'm not going to play now just for the sake of time, but I would recommend you look at the rights to decline mandatory COVID measures from Rocco Galati, where he talks about your human rights and informed consent and so on. And it's a great video to look through.
Today's newsletter.
Now, there are legal exemption forms that Vaccine Choice Canada has information on, and this is with regard to vaccines. But what's important from here to take away is how Health Canada in this statement talks about vaccines cannot be made mandatory in Canada because of the Canadian Constitution. There are some provinces that have legislation or regulations under Health Protection Acts that require proof of immunization for school entrance. However, it states that exceptions are permitted on medical or religious grounds and reasons of conscience, and that legislation and regulations must not be interpreted to imply compulsory immunization. So one of the tools you can look at is your Human Rights Commission. This is for Newfoundland and Labrador. They have a section specifically on COVID-19 and human rights and best practices. And they outline how people cannot be discriminated against because of not wearing a mask or having an exemption. So you can see how that's outlined there. They say how the Newfoundland and Labrador Human Rights Acts protect people from discrimination and harassment based on certain protected or prohibited grounds. You are protected in Newfoundland and Labrador in the areas of work, education, housing, healthcare, or in accessing any government or other public services. And those public services include stores, restaurants or bars, cabs, or sports or gym facilities. So they talk about employment and how employers, again, should, what they should do, prevent workplace harassment, offer sick and disability leave, make accommodations, and so on. Public services, stores and restaurants and housing, what they should do, preventing harassment as well, and not refuse service to customers based on COVID-19 fear and anxiety is included in here. And they talk specifically about the mandatory masks, and a service provider should take a person in good faith when they say that they are exempt from wearing a mask. There is no rule that a person show proof of their physical or mental health condition. The inability to access or use a mask should not result in a denial of access to a public space and/or public service. Refusing to serve a person with a physical or mental health condition may result in a human rights complaint. They talk about service providers could provide free masks and so on, make accommodations, offer different services like mask-free hours and things like that. They should also educate their staff about the mandatory mask order, which includes the exemptions and any other company policies or procedures, ensure a discrimination and harassment-free workplace or business, train staff how to respond if various situation arises, and remind staff not to deny service to anyone exempt from wearing a mask. Members of the public should also read the special measures order and determine if they're exempt. Practice and feel confident saying they're exempt. Remember, there's no rule to show proof. Know that they cannot be denied a service, and treat frontline staff with respect. Another tool that you can avail yourself of is the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and have a look at their letter that they wrote to the chief medical officers regarding the lockdown's adverse health impacts. So they wrote this to all of the chief medical officers in each province. And for example, here's the one to Dr. Janice Fitzgerald in Newfoundland and Labrador. And basically, you can look at the letter template, you can write your own, and they're requesting the candid and detailed response to the following questions, such as how many suicides are projected? How many do you project will die because of the rise in depression, anxiety, alcoholism, addictions, and so on? How many children and spouses do you project will be abused? And how many isolated seniors are projected to become sick or die because they no longer receive regular visitors, and so on. And then it ends with, if I receive no response to this letter, I will take that to mean that you and your staff have failed to calculate and consider the severe negative impact of the lockdown on the health and lives of citizens. I will have no choice but to conclude that no significant or meaningful research has been conducted on the crucial issues raised in this letter. I wish to remind you that your orders are violating citizens' charter freedoms. The onus is on government officials to justify these violations. So there was a response, and what you can do when you receive a response is to keep this, and this is important if you're going to go ahead with legal action later. You have evidence of receipt. Another resource to look at is from Intrepid, and they've gathered all of the emergency orders for each province in one place, so you can find all the documents. And so, for example, here's for Newfoundland and Labrador, and you can find the Public Health Protection and Promotion Act order, the first one on the 18th of March, and then the revised ones and so on, to see the language itself and what it specifically says and applies to. 369 Media developed a notice of liability to end for ending the declarations of emergency in Canada, which is something you can go and you can sign. They have it for each lieutenant governor in all of the provinces of Canada. And this is just a sample of the one from Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's very well written, and it states clearly the evidence that was available at the time when the emergencies were declared, and how this does not fit the definition of an emergency, and therefore the emergency is not justified, and requests that the evidence be provided or further action will be taken. Parents for Mask-Free Education is a great resource. They have a letter in the first aid kit for parents. That's for school boards, principals, and trustees. They have a section on Know Your Rights, school board information, and you can find out information about the masks themselves. This is something that should be a sign that is on all of the stores, that would not violate your human rights, that would not incite discrimination or violence. A safe space for all, no mask, we won't ask. We are inclusive to all. And this is a resource. You can screenshot this, print this out, pass it around to businesses that are on board with this, help to make businesses aware. So here's a summary of what we can do. The first thing, of course, is to be informed. Know your rights, know the scientific data, know what's really going on, and employ the knowledge to benefit. So take what you can use that's actionable and transform that into something that you can take action on in your day-to-day life. Like the parent letters, like the letter to the chief medical officers. You can write letters to government representatives requesting evidence, letter to lieutenant governor requesting proof of emergency. You can print out the no mask, we won't ask signs for businesses, or come up with your own. Come up with a letter to inform local businesses of their rights and warning against violations of human rights and the mask bylaws if service is refused to customers. Inform employees of the mask risk, of informed consent for testing, for masks, for all medical interventions, and workers' rights to accommodation and equal work for equal pay. You can look at lawsuits that are going on. You can consider legal action. You can help by donating to lawsuits such as Vaccine Choice Canada's lawsuits against the Government of Ontario, the Trudeau government, and the CBC. There's also the Ohio Stands Up lawsuit that is challenging the emergency. And you can find out locally really what's going on, because our power is strongest when it's really down to earth, something that is local, that connects to us intimately. So to end off, I'm going to share a few quotes here. This is from Etienne de la Boete. I probably mispronounced that, but this was from The Politics of Disobedience, the Discourse of Voluntary Servitude. And he says that resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus, whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight, and break into pieces. We are more powerful, each one of us individually, than we know. We've been taught that this is not so, but that is an illusion. And those who we fear, those who we think are in control, who have power, that is illusory. Don't give them the attention that they desire. Don't comply. Non compliance is the best thing we can do. All you need to do is say, no, I'm not having that. I'm going to live my life, and this is the way I'm going to live my life. And if you have to combat something, then when it confronts you, you're ready to combat it. You stand within your strength. It comes down to choice. There is no evidence to prove emergency, thus, no human rights can be abridged based on that claim. Informed consent can never be abridged. No emergency in Canada can abridge the Charter or Bill of Rights. The emergency status itself cannot abridge certain human rights as stated in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You also have disability rights and patient rights. Martin Luther King has said that one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. These would be laws that uphold our human rights and freedoms. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And I think we would all agree that in our human history, we have had unjust laws, and we are the better for it for disobeying them and making changes. Thomas Jefferson has also said, if a law is unjust, a man is not only right to disobey it, he is obligated to do so. Do we live in a free world? Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21, states that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Now, is this true today? Can anyone who dissents have a voice? Do the people have a voice in the policies, or do we just pass off our power and say, you over there, you deal with it? Is that our voice? Are our choices limited to submit or fight? And what kind of world is that? Nelson Mandela, another quote from him, we started off with a quote from him, said that for to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And to understand how to do that, you need to examine what it means to be free. You need to examine what it means to be human. You need to examine yourself and know yourself. You need to examine reality. You need to have a healthy respect for our fallibility, for our limitations in knowledge, and promote the best in all of us. Our rights are inalienable, inseparable. We are born with them, and we can always take our power back. As Henry David Thoreau said, the state is not armed with superior wit or honesty, but with superior physical strength. I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. Let us see who is the strongest. And just to go back with how life provides its own feedback mechanisms, regardless of whether human law is put into place. Gandhi has said that the good man is the friend of all living things. We can tell this by their actions, not whether or not they obey a law. Common sense is the realized sense of proportion, and those who know how to think need no teachers. Nobody can hurt me without my permission. In a gentle way, you can shake the world. Self-respect knows no considerations. Poverty is the worst form of violence. And where there is love, there is life. Peace is its own reward, and my life is my message. And I'm just going to finish off here with reminding us all about how Gandhi was able to be so successful. And it was not with protesting and fighting back, but it was getting the people to take their power back, to start making their own food again, making their own clothes again, not being tied to masters, not being made dependents to another man or woman, but to coexist in nature peacefully together, our unity in diversity. So I'm going to stop there, and I realize this is a long webinar. Um, please take notes, look at the resources, do some research yourself, but know that there are tools for you. Know that you have every right to disobey unjust orders. And you have all of the evidence and your human rights and lots of documents to back you up should they be challenged. So stand in your power, own it, and take it. And we can do this. All right. Thank you and good night.